Good. A very warm welcome to the Huguenot Society's first live meeting for 20 months. We are most encouraged to see a good number of fellows and guests here in person for the Randolph Vine Memorial Lecture, with others attending via Zoom, including several from overseas. Overall, we have about 95 attendants. Our thanks are due to the Dutch church staff for their assistance in tonight's event and to the team who have made this hybrid meeting technically possible, in particular, Mr. Bill Upchurch. We have today received the good wishes of Randolph Vine's widow, Gillian. I am delighted to welcome our speaker for the fourth Randolph Vine Memorial Lecture, Dr. Charles Littleton, an active member of the Society for many years and a good friend of Randolph, with whom in 2000 he organized the Society's International Conference From Strangers to Citizens and subsequently edited the papers with him for the eponymous publication. This memorable conference took place mainly at the Dutch Church here in Austin Friars, so it is most fitting that Charles should be delivering the fourth memorial lecture here tonight. Dr. Littleton is a senior research associate at the History of Parliament Trust, working particularly on the members of the House of Lords between 1660 and 1790. Prior to that, between 1996 and 2001, he worked as a researcher for the Robert Boyle Project, which culminated in an edition of the complete works and correspondence of that 17th century natural philosopher. His earlier doctoral dissertation was on the French and Walloon immigrants in London and their French church in Threadneedle Street in the late 16th century. And significantly, he tells me he has kept a hand in this subject after all these years, thanks largely to the encouragement of the co-author and guiding spirit of this paper, Dr. Alistair Duke, who joins us this evening via Zoom. Dr. Duke is Emeritus Reader in History at Southampton University. He has written widely on aspects of the Dutch Revolt in the late 16th century, in works such as Reformation and Revolt in the Low Countries. Dr. Duke has also supported the Society through his supervision of students who have made a contribution to its work, most notably the late Marcel Backhaus and our former editor Andrew Spicer, whose works on the Flemish and Walloon immigrant communities in respectively Sandwich and Southampton were supervised by him, and with whom he subsequently published volumes of essays. Tonight's paper arises from work Dr. Duke carried out with both Dr. Lien Liu and Dr. Littleton, and I understand that the final project on which it is based would not have been completed without his encouragement and support. Finally, I would like to mention on this occasion a friend of Randolph Vine and a contributor to the Stranger to Citizens Conference at Austin Friars, namely our late fellow Jean Tushima, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, Archivist Emeritus of the Honourable Artillery Company, who died last December. As founder and editor of the Huguenot and Walloon Gazette, the extensive research spearheaded by Jean on Flemish and Walloon immigrants to the area of the Fens and to the city of Norwich deserves to be celebrated. So over to Dr. Littleton for his paper, There's scarcely a day when my heart does not weep, letters of families separated during the Flemish and Walloon exile in England in the 1560s.
Good evening, and thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I am honored to have been invited to deliver the fourth annual, I do not know the number, but the fourth annual Randolph Vine Memorial Lecture, and particularly to have been asked to deliver it in this venue, the Dutch Church at Austin Friars. As Barbara has suggested in her introduction, both Randolph Vine and the Dutch Church have a special meaning for me. Now, the 16th century immigrants from the Low Countries saw this church, or the church that was on this site at that time, the late 16th century, as their spiritual home. And they are the subject not only of this presentation, but also of my doctoral research so many years ago. And that is how Randolph Vine first knew me when I immigrated to this country from the USA back so many years ago, back in the mid-1990s. And as an immigrant, not a refugee, I should hasten to say, I am thankful to Randolph for the support and encouragement he gave me as I tried to settle here, both socially and professionally. In particular, I'm grateful for the way he integrated me into the society through employing me in various roles, and particularly, again, as Barbara mentioned, as we organized the conference From Strangers to Citizens in this very venue and other places, but with Barbara's help and Katie Michael as well. We all were a group that organized this conference in 2000 to mark the 450th anniversary of the foundation of the Strangers Church. And also, I'm grateful to Randolph for enlisting me as his co-editor of the volume of published papers coming from that conference. It certainly sort of set me off in my early days before all those other things that Barbara mentioned, where I am now, well into the 18th century. That is why it is so fitting in that I, of all people, deliver this lecture based on Dr. Duke's work with my assistants, that I deliver this lecture on this particular topic in this particular building. And I would just like to reiterate, as Barbara said, that I would like to, if I may be presumptuous enough, in gratitude for all that Randolph did for me in my early years and in later years as well, if I could sort of, dare I say, dedicate this lecture, this presentation to him. And also to the second person that Barbara mentioned, who also would have taken a particular interest in this topic, and who also, I should say, encouraged me in my early years, because she knew of my interest in the 16th century immigrants, and that is Jean Tsushima, or Tsushima, I don't quite know where to put the accent. So I deliver this with remembrance of both of those two very influential people in my life, and also in the study of the earlier immigration of the late 16th century of immigrants from the Low Countries. And that is, as you can imagine, and as it suggests, and I should also say a third person, Dr. Duke, who is not, who is on Zoom, but without whom this project would not have been completed. The project I will be talking about tonight would not have been completed. It was languishing for several years, but he pushed it forward, and it was largely him who devised this presentation and the way it's going to be presented and the order of topics. So this is a very much, he largely wrote it with some input from me, but I am having the honor to deliver it. So that is our topic tonight: the immigrants from the Netherlands, from Northern France, the French-speaking and Dutch-speaking and Flemish-speaking areas of the Low Countries. There have been a trickle of them under Edward VI, and it was in 1550 that the Strangers Church was founded on this particular site. That became a flood in the early years of Elizabeth I's reign. It is impossible to give precise figures, as the immigrant communities were always in a state of flux, but a reasonable estimate is that by 1572, somewhere between 17,000 and 20,000 people from the Low Countries had settled in England, particularly in the southeast and East Anglia, as this map suggests. So the main places that are going to be mentioned, of course, are London, but also Norwich, Sandwich a few times as well. So why did they come over? The mid-1560s witnessed widespread religious disturbances in the Low Countries. In August 1566, the local Calvinists sacked literally hundreds of churches in Flanders, and the phenomenon of the iconoclastic riots then spread across the Low Countries later that year. Here is a print depicting the iconoclastic riots from a particularly Protestant point of view. As winter of 1566 gave way to the spring of 1567, the Habsburg government in Brussels gradually reasserted its grip. The punishment of those who had desecrated churches and resisted the Catholic authorities now got underway. The special court, the Council of Troubles, also nicknamed the Council of Blood, launched investigations across the Low Countries, and over 10,000 people were cited to appear. And sorry, there we are. The tyranny of Alba. So the Duke of Alba was the representative of the Spanish government, of the Habsburg government, sent to sent to the Netherlands to reassert order. You can see him sitting on his throne. And the women in chains kneeling before him represent the various provinces of the Habsburg Low Countries. I should have checked beforehand. I think there should be 17. Dr. Duke could correct me, but I have not counted 17. I think I only count 15 there, but they are supposed to represent the provinces of the Low Countries in chains. So most of those who were cited to appear prudently did not heed the summons, and they sought refuge abroad. Subsequently, these were condemned to be banished and their property was confiscated. So maintaining contact between the families left behind in Flanders and Wallonia and the refugees in England was clearly of the utmost importance for all concerned. The refugees, having departed, probably in some haste, left behind many loose ends which their wives and relatives had to sort out as best they could. Ordinarily, postal services in early modern Europe were, to say the least, erratic, but communications were especially difficult for those caught up in the exodus of the later 1560s. For one thing, families back in the Low Countries might have had little idea where their husbands, sons, or daughters were living in England. It took time for letters to reach their destination. A fortnight was the minimum, but often months passed and sometimes years. Letters too often went astray. When wives were starved of news about their husbands, they could feel abandoned. That was how Annette Ranier felt as she told her husband in a letter of 1570. He, we know, had joined the French Calvinist Church in London 2 years earlier. Though she had been gravely ill on 2 occasions, she had only got a message from him that had been passed on by a third party. She had expected him to write back as soon as possible, and his failure led her to suppose he was indifferent. So she wrote, "As for our 2 children, they are doing well." But then she added a tad sarcastically, "if you're wondering." The experience of Jacqueline, the wife of Jean d'Ambrun from Valenciennes, was not untypical. In February 1570, Jacqueline wrote to express her despair, not having heard from her husband in London for 2 years. She didn't know what to make of his failure to reply to her letters. There we go. And so there you have the translation on the right, which you can try to match with the original French on the left. And that shows the extent of her anxiety. So you can be reading the letter, but in summary, she told him she wanted to join him in London, but first she needed to know what he wanted her to do with her children and whether he had the means to support them. Though her letter was never delivered, having been intercepted, as will be discussed later, she must still have established contact with her husband, for we know from a register of aliens in London, compiled in November 1571, that Jacqueline did in fact manage to join her husband in London along with 2 of their daughters. Indeed, the couple was still there 28 years later. So to make matters worse, the authorities in the Low Countries did their hardest to disrupt this postal traffic. The very act of sending a letter to a refugee or receiving one from abroad incurred the suspicion of those in authority. Because of the dangers attached to receiving such letters, one father had told his children in Norwich not to write home. Correspondents therefore often resorted to elementary subterfuges. They used pseudonyms, addressed their letters to safe houses for onward transmission, and asked recipients to destroy the letters. We gain an insight into this clandestine world from 2 collections of such letters, which form the core of this talk. And the letters in these 2 collections have been translated into English by Dr. Alistair Duke and myself, and made available on the web for all to read on the University of Leiden's Dutch Revolt site. So there's the homepage with the links to the 2 collections of letters. So the first one, called the Janssen Correspondence on the webpage. These were a cache of letters that ended up in the hands of the authorities back in Ypres in Flanders. Already in late July 1567, letters sent by refugees in Norwich were handed over to the magistrates in Ypres by fearful recipients. To understand why they were so nervous, we should remember that the mood in Flanders had changed drastically in the previous few months. Whereas in the autumn of 1566, the Calvinists in the southern Netherlands had been cock-a-hoop and the Catholic majority had been cowed, a year later, roles had been reversed, and now the Calvinists were on the back foot. So addressees were now either embarrassed to receive such incriminating material or felt the need to parade their loyalty to government in Brussels by surrendering these letters to the magistrates. Some of these letters came to light when the houses of the correspondents were searched, and we know this because some bear the annotation videator, that is in Latin, they had been seen, it had been seen. So they've been examined by a third party, a Habsburg official. Evidently, they were being read to find out about the recipient's religious orthodoxy. Now, unfortunately, these 60-odd letters were lost when the town archives in Ypres were destroyed by enemy action in 1914, which we are trying to remember in this particular period in November. What remains, though, are extensive extracts published in 1857 by the church historian Hendrik Janssen. And here is the, again, please. Yeah, here is the opening page of the web page of the translation of the Janssen extracts, which had been done by Dr. Duke. As they're in Flemish, I did not deal with these particular letters. So we owe the second collection of letters to the misfortune that befell one of the probably numerous couriers and peddlers traveling between Flanders and England. Some may have carried letters as a kindness to friends, but others done so in the hope of cashing in on the desperation of others. The 140 or so letters in both of these collections can only have represented a tiny fraction of the epistolary traffic between immigrants in England and their families back home. Several messengers paid dearly for carrying such letters. For instance, one was sentenced to be flogged and banished from Flanders for 10 years. Another was burnt alive at Ypres as a heretic, but also for carrying letters of other heretics. A man named Henri Fleel was another such carrier. He was intercepted, as we know in detail, at 8 a.m. on Sunday, 26th of February, 1570, just short of Calais, as he was about to cross the then border between the Low Countries and France. He had on him 79 letters bound for the Netherlands in England, most of which were destined for London. These had been picked up that month from 10 or so villages across Flanders and the French-speaking towns to the south of the Netherlands. The letters were secreted in Henri's tunic and hose, and also in a purpose-made peddler's pack with a false bottom. And here is the inventory of goods that were found on Henri Fleel, and we have this document. It is bound up with the letters as well. As we can see, the captors, the officials, came across silver coins, sundry tools, and various items of clothing, as well as such nostalgic delicacies and presents as cheeses, jam, and gingerbread, all of them concealed beneath an innocuous layer of onions, apples, and other fruit. At the time of his arrest, Fleel was also escorting a boy of 9 or 10 to his father in England. Though the fate of this messenger, and I should say the boy, is not known for certain, we may surmise that Fleel certainly was put to death as an obstinate heretic, for under interrogation, he made no secret of his Protestant beliefs. His downfall is actually our good fortune, for these letters were disappeared into the archives of the Council of Troubles established by the Duke of Alba, from where they were disinterred and published by the Belgian scholar Alphonse Verheyden in 1955. And here is the opening of the webpage of our translations to the Verheyden letters, again on the University of Leiden's website. So the letters in these two dossiers do not shed startling new light about high politics. When we eavesdrop on the conversations of quite ordinary men and women, for the most part artisans, we encounter run-of-the-mill discussions of domestic matters. The humdrum existence of these people had been turned upside down because they had been caught up in the tumultuous aftermath of the disturbances of 1566 and 1567. And just to help out, I hope it's a help, here is also a contemporary map of the region of the Netherlands I will be discussing tonight, with some of the major towns highlighted: Calais, Nieuwpoort, Yper, Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp. And I would like to be able to, there's Calais, good, it's working. Nieuwpoort, I think that's Yper, sorry, I should know. Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp. But if you can read small print, you might be able to see others that come up. So it is a matter of note, in particular, that almost 1/3 of the letters carried by the unfortunate messenger were sent by women. True, we cannot always be certain that whether the senders in fact wrote them, and the sometimes clumsy phraseology suggests that someone was acting as an amanuensis. But the riskiness of sending them and their intimate nature strengthens the case for thinking that most of those sent by women were indeed written by them. We should also remember that these letters often had to be hastily composed. Indeed, more than 1 in 5 of the letters published by Verheyen ends with the phrase "in haste." And there is good reason to suppose that these were written at short notice, for the correspondence probably had little or no warning when the messenger would arrive and leave again. Thomas Ledon entered his short letter in 1570, which I hope to get there, yes. So this is from the webpage on the University of Leiden site. He ended his letter of 1570 to his sister Anne with the remark that had been written at 5 heures du matin, at 5 in the morning, as you can see there at the bottom. Yes, there, the pointer. As he was writing this on 1st of February, Thomas must therefore have worked by candlelight to catch the post. In these circumstances, it would not have been easy to find someone who would have been prepared to act as scribe at short notice. Now, it would be wrong, to say the least, to pretend that the letters, especially those written in French, are easy to understand or translate, as I can attest. Intelligibility suffers on account of their frequent phonetic spelling. One of the easier examples would be like the word eau, meaning water, might be written as the letter O. Earlier I was discussing with somebody who's also looked at these letters. Comment, C-O-M-M-E-N-T, would be spelled Q-U-E, new word, M-E-N. There are numerous examples. You really have to read phonetically to sort of figure out, oh, that's the word they're trying to write. They also exhibit irregular syntax, as you could expect, far from formal French, either of today or even of the 16th century. Nevertheless, the literacy of these humble men and women from Flanders and Wallonia, who were for the most part cloth workers and artisans, is remarkable. After all, the ability to compose an entire letter of, say, 200 words and to write it under pressure, in haste, presupposes a fluency far beyond that needed to sign one's name, which is the usual index social historians use to measure basic literacy. So I need to talk a bit about literacy in the Low Countries in this period a bit. Writing was a technical exercise. You had to know how to hold the pen correctly and how to sharpen a quill. It also presupposed a modicum of wealth, since ink, quills, and paper were relatively expensive. So children were only taught to write after they could read, and as school teachers charged more for writing, the odds were that the children of poor parents, especially girls, would be set to work before they would have acquired the skill. Yet our Flemish and Walloon artisans and their wives and sisters were fortunate in coming from a region where a rudimentary education was fairly widely available from 1500. The opportunities of employment offered by towns like Bruges, Ghent, Tournai, and Antwerp evidently stimulated schooling in the surrounding regions. Ludovico Guicciardini, a Florentine noble who had settled in Antwerp, observed in 1567 in his description of the Low Countries that, quote, "the common people have for the most part some rudiments of grammar, and almost everywhere they can at least read and write. Yes, even the farmers and country folk." And the French scholar Scaliger, who became a professor at Leiden University at the end of the 16th century, also observed that in Holland, peasant men and women, as well as servant girls, knew how to write. Now, though Guicciardini and Scaliger may have been overpraising the literacy of the rural inhabitants of their adopted country, artisan Netherlanders may well have been more literate than their English compeers. To determine levels of literacy, social historians on both sides of the North Sea have looked at how people validated legal documents. If they signed their statements, or did they make do with a mark? And so this methodology provides us with some crude comparative data. According to a detailed study of the witnesses appearing before the consistory court for the Diocese of Norwich between 1580 and 1700, just over 1/3 of the yeomen and 2/5 of the craftsmen could not sign their own names. In the case of women, the great majority, 89%, made do with a mark. According to another scholar, 1 man in 5 and 1 woman in 20 in England could sign their name at the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign. By 1642, this had risen to 1 man in 3 and 1 woman in 10. Already by 1500, the network of village schools in the Low Countries was sufficiently close-knit to give most Netherlanders a fair chance of acquiring an elementary education, though this might well not include writing. And there seems to have been the subsequent disruption caused by the revolt and the eventual triumph of the Catholic Reformation in the southern provinces in the late 16th century might have had a dampening effect on the standards of educational attainment. But I think if we look at the situation in the United Provinces, the northern provinces, it may give us a hint of the educational situation throughout the Habsburg Low Countries before the Counter-Reformation took hold in the south. And we know from studies that in Amsterdam in 1630, 57% of the men and 32% of the women could sign their names rather than make a mark. Again, compare this to England in 1642, when the figures are 33% for men and 10% for women. So there does seem to be a higher level of literacy in the Low Countries. And there's visual evidence of this as well. A painting from the late 17th century by a little-known artist shows a woman teaching a class of young girls in Gouda, that's Gouda, Gouda, to read. So again, it's not seen as something unusual. And of course, the association between Dutch women and letter writing was sufficiently established for painters in the mid-17th century, like Gerard de Boch here, and of course, the famous, if I can get to it, Vermeer, to develop a mini genre of painting showing a well-to-do lady reading, writing, or receiving a letter. All of this is to suggest that female education and literacy in the Low Countries was common and not at all seen as exceptional. So with that background, let us return now to our refugees and their letters. As has been said, many Netherlanders sought refuge in England from the spring of 1567, when the central government regained the upper hand. When the migrants went abroad, they did not enter an entirely unknown world. They sailed to England from ports like Calais, Nieuwpoort, and Antwerp, and went to towns of which they already had some knowledge from those who had preceded them, and where they had reason to suppose they could find work. They came by established routes. Those who went to Norwich were told to go via Newport, where, while awaiting a ship, they were advised to take lodgings at an inn called the Halve Maan, the Half Moon. All this advice is found in the Janssen letters, by the way. If lucky, they could get a passage with a skipper called Wolfhard Bertman, who regularly took furniture, tools, and letters to Yarmouth. Those bound for Norwich were told to make sure that the vessel was going directly to East Anglia. If they went via Sandwich, they were warned the passage would cost them twice as much. Now, if many Protestants leaving Ypres headed for Norwich, those going from Valenciennes seem initially to have set their sights on Southampton. London, of course, attracted immigrants from all over. And by participating in what social historians have called chain migration, the immigrants were able to take advantage of networks which helped them choose a destination where there were occupational opportunities. Even so, the prospect of moving overseas was understandably daunting. Several correspondents lamented that they had no money for the crossing. One husband thoughtfully sent his wife a barrel of herring for her to sell to defray the expenses of the journey. The would-be migrant had to make his or her way along unfamiliar roads, which in winter were often flooded, as that letter suggests. While en route, wayfarers had to steer clear of officers who might want to question them. Then they had to hang about at the port until they could negotiate a passage across the North Sea. Those who had to cross the French border to reach Calais might also need some form of passport. Understandably, some hesitated to set out without the services of a reliable guide. Yes. Especially when children were involved. The wife of Martin Plenard was certainly only being realistic when she told her husband living in Norwich in February 1570 that it is hardly a journey for a woman and 2 children. And we will return to the wife of Martin Plenard later and her letter. The financial hardships of the families back in the Low Countries was a recurrent topic in these letters. Debts and rents had somehow to be paid despite the disappearance of the main breadwinner. The problems facing the family which remained behind were made very much worse because the central government in Brussels tried to seize the estate of those condemned by the Council of Troubles. Families might be able to prevent the bailiffs distraining their chattels, but only if they could scrape together the money to do so. Those who had lent the money were understandably annoyed when the refugees or their families failed to honor their agreements. One sympathizes with the widow Geneviève, who had lent money to Nicaise Frappe. And Dr. Duke has been kind enough to find the original of this letter and to take a photograph of it or a digital image of it, so you can compare the translation to the original. Nicaise had been a Calvinist merchant from Ternay, but after having been banished, he had moved to London, where he and his family attended the Threadneedle Street Church. The widow had lent him money, and now she wanted it back. She was in a bad way, having suffered from a fire, but until the money she had lent was repaid, she could not provide a dowry for her daughter. And if you're following at home, I think we start on the no, there it is, the 15th line down. Okay. Vous êtes cause que ma fille a refusé bon mariage. Car s'il y fut quelque bon mari, voir un prince, pour un prince, il n'eût pas été possible de le marier. Car l'Église est telle qu'on ne demande point les filles pour leur savoir, mais pour leur argent, which we translated as, you are the reason that my daughter has refused a good marriage. For if there had come along a good husband, indeed a prince, it would not have been possible to marry him. For the fashion is such that they do not ask for girls for their knowledge, but for their money. And I singled this one out because this is actually one of the more clearly written, both in handwriting and actually in comprehensibility of all the letters. So you can almost follow it along if you're familiar with 16th century handwriting. Nor was it easy for those who'd gone abroad to collect monies owed to them. Okay. A sister who had stayed behind at Ypres had to tell her brother, Copa Arnaud, who had asked her to recover certain small debts, that people were disinclined to pay these. Quote, and if you demand it, they will be very angry. This reminds us that the families of refugees could probably not expect, in the aftermath of the Calvinist attacks on the parish churches and religious houses, much sympathy from their Catholic neighbors. In Tournai, we learned some households had the added imposition of having Spanish soldiers billeted on them. These had to be provided with candles, changes of linen, and be allowed to warm themselves at the main hearth, something this indignant correspondent found a matter against reason. Yes. A sense of loneliness pervaded some of the letters. Isabeau Parent told her husband somewhere in England how happy she was to have had a letter from him. Her own affairs were, however, not going well. She had rented an upstairs room to 2 workers, less for the money she earned than, as she explained to her husband, to ease my sadness a bit, for they both keep me very joyful. Her husband had wanted her to join him, and Isabeau told him she would indeed like to do so. I promise you that my body is here, but my heart is with you very often. However, friends had counseled her against traveling at the moment. The mother of Benoit de la Cour, okay, this is a bit harder to read, much smaller print. The mother of Benoit de la Cour was missing her son and other family members badly. She told them she cried many times a week and was pining away. She prayed God that they might be living near her. They would bring her joy. Because, and this section, if you're trying to follow along, which I know is very ambitious, this will begin at the end of the 7th line down. I'm not going to try to read it because this is an example of poorly spelled, or I shouldn't say poorly spelled, but idiosyncratically spelled French. So I'm not even going to try. She writes, I have a very strange husband, and I would comfort myself sometimes with you, and now I don't have anybody, and it always seems to me that I will never see you again, nor my 2 daughters, nor your children, for whom I grieve so much that I would not know how to write to you about it. She desperately wanted to know how they all were, and in particular, whether the wound on Benoit's wife's head had healed. A few months earlier, she had had a baby girl, and as a result, she was feeling exhausted. Though she immediately added with maternal pride, the tiny creature is the most beautiful child you would ever see in 1,000. When she wrote, she hoped that within a month she would be with him. Again, some of the family letters are poignant on account of their tenderness and directness. Yes, this is Martin Plenard. I told you we would come back to this letter. His wife, when he heard concludes her letter by telling him that your daughters Annette and Marie are always asking when their father will come. Your daughter Marie says that you do not know how to get back and that there's something wrong with your feet, and that your feet hurt. That's how it should be translated down there. Okay. A father writing from Valenciennes to his daughter in England assures her that the 2 children she had had to leave behind, quote, are doing well and are growing in size and beauty, and little David is a joy. David, he added, sent greetings to his mother, his brother, and his sister, quote, and he kissed me this morning by way of sending you his greeting. Guy Jouard from Armentières had been obliged to leave the Low Countries because he was wanted for having participated in the iconoclastic riots in his hometown in 1566. His wife was missing him badly, yet she faced the future in a spirit of quiet confidence, sustained by her Protestant faith. She wrote very tenderly to her husband, since it has pleased God to keep us so far from one another, we must not in our hearts forget one another. When I look back on the happy past, there's scarcely a day when my heart doesn't weep. I pray God, who keeps watch over us, will give us patience. I hope that things will not long stay as they are. A close analysis of the religious idiom of these private letters leaves one in no doubt of their deep commitment to the new religion. For one thing, their correspondence is conspicuously devoid of allusions to the protective powers of the Virgin Mary or the saints. Instead, the writers repeatedly invoke le bon Dieu, who looks after them in this life, and they often concluded their letters by praying that he will protect those to whom they are writing. They praise him for his mercy and for providing them with the means to make a living. Philippe Collier gave thanks to God who, despite their enemies, had provided them with food. God, he continued, paraphrasing Calvin's translation of Psalm 23, nous a fait reposer au parc herbeux et conduit au long des eaux croix. And that's line 8, if anybody's trying to follow along. That is, he has made us rest in grassy pastures and led us along tranquil waters. These correspondents placed their confidence in God's providence and took spiritual comfort from knowing that, whatever their recent hardships and the pain of separation from their families, they could leave everything in his hands. They reminded themselves that without God, they can do nothing. In the words of the psalmist cited by one correspondent, God is my refuge in time of trouble. A brother in Valenciennes encouraged his sibling by reminding him how well the Souverain Sieur, notre bon Dieu, that's the sovereign Lord, our good God, looked after his servants, and recalled how Jesus Christ delivered St. Peter from prison. This, he went on, was a miraculous thing, but God's power has in no way diminished since that time. The frequency and spontaneity of such language testifies to the evident strength of their commitment to the theology of the Reformation, and demonstrates how deeply they had been influenced by the Calvinist services they had attended. Incidentally, one refugee in Norwich even asked a friend at Ypres to send across the chair the friend's mother had used at Calvinist open-air preachings in 1566. So he obviously put great value on this sort of artifact that was present at these open-air preachings of the summer of 1566. The strength of these Protestant convictions comes as something of a surprise because the region from which these Walloons and Flemings came from had been exposed to the newer doctrines for less than 20 years. Indeed, several correspondents in England were concerned lest their family and friends back home might relapse into Catholicism, or at least outwardly confirm. The former minister at Ypres, who went on to play the same role in Norwich, warned one prominent inhabitant of Ypres, who had earlier been sympathetic to the Reformed faith, that it is the Lord's will that we should only serve him. When that is not possible, he wrote, quote, we should depart from Babylon, from the Roman idolatry. May God grant that you might be so moved that you flee and shun the place where such tyranny is not only exercised over the body, but also over the soul, and that you may go to church where body and soul may become comforted, and he will serve the Lord in his church. Another stalwart of the Norwich Stranger Church also wrote to the same individual because he feared he would deny his evangelical faith. Don't let yourself be tempted, he warned, by honor, riches, the world, or anything else, for people must not dissemble, for God shuns dissemblers. You may not serve God with your heart and idolatry with your body. Now, some families had divided loyalties when it came to choosing between Catholicism and the Reformation. A husband pleaded with his wife to join him in Norwich, where they would lead godly lives together. He begged her to turn her back on the Catholic faith. She should be prepared to face death rather than partake in such idolatry. He wrote, quote, when I lived in wickedness, then you followed me, but now I live in godliness and in fear of God. You don't follow me. How can your conscience be at peace? Sometimes the religious tensions within families provoked heated exchanges. This woman living in Norwich received a stern rebuke from her Catholic uncle back in Ypres. He accused her of disobeying her parents and threatened to disinherit her unless she returned home. And as you can see, she replied defiantly in early 1567 with a reasoned theological argument, or at least one based on scripture. So she knew her scripture well enough that she could cite chapter and verse. And as for the threat to disinherit her, she warned him not to commit a mortal sin. But if he went ahead, that was too bad. She looked forward to an eternal inheritance. Now, since she was later banished and her property confiscated, it looks as if she did not heed her uncle's warnings. The authorities in Ypres, however, did accept her letter as exoneration of her uncle that he was not harboring any Protestant sympathy. So in other words, he produced the letter to say, look at me, my niece might be a heretic, but I am Orthodox. And that's how it's survived to us. Well, it hasn't survived to us because it was bombed in 1914, but it had survived into the 19th century. Religious differences did not stop one fervent Calvinist who stood accused of smashing religious images in Ypres in 1566. He sought a rapprochement with his Catholic sister and brother-in-law. He wrote in October 1567 from Norwich to his family in Ypres. After sending greetings, this wood-turner and his wife expressed their sadness that the family back in Flanders had broken off all contact, as you can see. And it's a long, reasoned argument trying to conciliate the family. And as a peace offering, in addition, he sent his sister and brother-in-law 2 cheeses. In fact, on a lighter note, cheeses were often sought after presents and peace offerings. One other refugee in Norwich sent his brother and sister-in-law in Flanders a cheese, while the peddler, you might remember, who was intercepted en route to Calais, was carrying 2 cheeses in his pack. Right. So these letters from ordinary people, le menu peuple, as the French say, in the early modern period are comparatively rare. There is, of course, no lack of correspondence from scholars and from the political and religious elites of this period, but very few letters from craftsmen and especially women have survived. The many letters included in some 16th century martyrologies were indeed often the work of men and women from lowly social positions, but in the absence of the original autographs, there must be a strong presumption that these were touched up before publication, correcting the grammar perhaps, but also to ensure doctrinal conformity. What makes the 2 collections of letters under discussion tonight, and which are now available in English translation on these websites, what makes them so precious is that they are unmediated. They are direct, raw, written in haste, often close to incomprehensible, but they show distraught, ordinary cloth workers and artisans, literate, yes, but largely uneducated. And they show their inner emotions, their thoughts. They're upset by the ravages caused by the persecution in the Low Countries and by the subsequent exile and refuge that so many Netherlanders took in this country. They provide insights into the way families on both sides of the North Sea coped with the vicissitudes and emotional upheaval of exile and separation in the first phase of the crisis in the Netherlands. Thank you very much.